Coming to you live, but not really. It is all pomp and no circumstance with Ryder Richards on LetUsThinkAboutIt.com, the amateur hour you should never tune into.
Welcome back. This is Ryder Richards with Let Us Think About It. Okay, so we're back this week, and we're going to be continuing our psychological analysis of modern man. This is based on the book Escape from Freedom, written around 1942 by Erich Fromm. Now, last episode, we gave some insight and history into why someone might want to escape from freedom. We also bring up the ideas of sadomasochism and automaton conformity, but we didn't really dive into what those are and how they function psychologically. And perhaps more importantly, is the thing we need the most, the answer to how we escape the desire to escape from freedom. So it's one thing to diagnose the problem, but something else entirely to offer the solution. Now, considering the escape from freedom, then of course discussing freedom as an island is kind of convenient. I mean, it's kind of the no man is an island and all that stuff, right? But the reality is that to be an independent, autonomous individual, it might only be possible in seclusion, alone, and isolated, on a desert island. As a quick recap on some concepts we've talked about before, way back in step 11, there's this thing called positive and negative liberty, or freedom to and freedom from. Now, if you decide that to be free, you need to be on an island, alone, to be independent, then what you're doing is removing any external restraints upon yourself, such as a government or other people. And you are free from restraint, so you can, take off your clothes and do the tallywhacker dance whenever you feel like it. But what if your goal is to contribute to the welfare of others? Well, then you'd have to come back and participate in society, right? You would actually need to escape from Freedom Island and get back to society. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to give up your independence or unique self. But of course, it would include some restraints to live in society. It means you really have to find a way to be yourself and to navigate the systems and cultures of others, and somehow still find the resources to achieve your goal. What most of us really want society to do is make sure that we have as few restraints as possible while having the most resources available, which of course can help us to be free, and this is free to achieve our goals without hurting others. Now, what becomes troublesome is when people want to buy something like explosives because they want to be free to let their inner pyro loose. Of course, but I should also have the right to be free from worrying about being blown up. So this is the paradox. Now, when people are told, "You are free," they tend to think of it oftentimes in terms of fulfilling their libidinal desires and positive freedom. And, much like a child, we can tend to throw a tantrum when any restraint is put upon us, when anyone says no and slaps our hand. Now, I think we all understand this. But if we produce citizens who never move into adult social responsibility because, perhaps they're insecure individuals, made insecure by a lack of social stability, maybe they've been trained to submit at school and by parents to obvious nonsense and to accept flat-out lies. And then at some point, you're also being told that rationality and wealth are more important than your emotions. Well, it's probably ridiculous to expect a whole integrated person to somehow arise from this society. And yet, that is precisely what a successful democracy relies upon. Not self-interested children or group conformists who throw away responsibility, but thoughtful and sensitive, far-sighted citizens.
Part 4. Escape Mechanisms. First escape mechanism from freedom is authoritarianism, which is underpinned by sadomasochism.
So to continue our story from the last episode, our old buddy Reed isn't doing so well. Since losing his parents Vicky and Valerie, first to his shoe empire ambition, and then to social climbing, and later he lost them to diphtheria and scarlet fever. Well, now he feels lost, and he needs something to latch onto. So Fromm says here he has a choice, where he can choose positive freedom, which is to relate to the world spontaneously using his full self, sensual, emotional, and intellectual, to relate to the world without giving up the integrity of his self. Or, in an unbearable state of isolation, aloneness, and insecurity, he may choose to bond or relate to the world by giving away his freedom. Now, near a state of panic, he may, as Fromm says,
try to overcome his aloneness by eliminating the gap that has arisen between his individual self and the world.
Unfortunately, this requires surrendering individuality. So sure, it assuages the anxiety, fear, and loneliness temporarily,
but it does not solve the underlying problem and is paid for by a kind of life that consists only of automatic or compulsive activities.
So Reed, exhausted and alone, frustrated, disparaging himself, he meets this guy named John at church. Well, John, he's a big shot, right? He's running for political office. And he reminds Reed frequently that Reed is a sinner, horrible sinner. And really, to be a better person, Reed needs to work harder and do more for others, like John. And of course, it really is a bother for John to have to waste all of his time disciplining and constantly berating Reed. I mean, John is an important man after all. And though it's embarrassing, I mean, really, John assures him that all of this humiliation it's of course for Reed's own good. So Reed continues to submit, to be exploited and controlled. Fromm says it's easy enough to understand the sadist in a world where somebody lacks control and stability, where they lack importance and meaning. That controlling someone else, they get a feeling from that. It reasserts their power, it bolsters their identity. Now the sadist, though cruel, he really needs and is reliant on the masochist, forming a strong bond with them. More difficult to explain may be the masochist though, right? But by submitting and releasing or immolating their individuality, which is their self, they tie themselves to another person, someone stronger, and this helps them feel more secure, more seen, more significant, even if it hurts a lot. The real aim here is to forget oneself and release burdens. For most, both character traits actually exist in tandem to varying degrees, hence is why they call it a sadomasochistic character rather than just sado or masochistic. And this is where the traits that make the sadist authoritarian are also seen in the masochists, who are drawn to strength, authority, and power. And of course, if presented with the opportunity, the masochist would possibly dominate or become sadistic as well. Now, when Fromm speaks of Hitler, he talks of his fascination with authority, where Hitler has a reverence that kind of hinted at the masochism of needing and wanting power, of cozying up to power, and then of course rebelling against these same people for perceived weaknesses. So in the end, no one is strong enough, and the authoritarian invokes the power of the fate or destiny so he can keep fighting rather than feel powerless. Now this is very common for the authoritarian, to use fate as a tool or destiny. It allows him to claim freedom and independence while declaring that there's a destiny to which we must submit, and that fate curtails our freedoms, for our own good, of course. Now the authoritarian will always lean on a higher power for more power. Now this is interesting. If a sadomasochist sees an authority figure that they adore apologize or show any weakness, they turn on them immediately. The authoritarians, the sadomasochists, they're not revolutionaries expanding rights. They are mercenary rebels driven by emotion to diminish others. The leader they once worshipped, who stumbles, this object of their affection, is the source of their own identity's power and strength. And so they tend to react as if the leader betrayed them personally. See, everything is a power relation to the authoritarian. Now, Fromm says that both sadism and masochism are the outcomes of one basic need: the inability to bear the isolation and weakness of one's own self.
Next escape mechanism to escape from freedom is destruction.
We touched on the death drive during the last episode, where a feeling of unbearable isolation and powerlessness can lead to anxiety, feeling out of control, or wanting to lash out. But without an object to lash out against, some people turn the violence against themselves, which provides stillness and peace in the respite of death. Now, when you cannot get what you want or desire, powerlessness can lead to destruction. not some sort of control or submission dynamic, rather than attempting the kind of symbiosis like the sadomasochist with the object of their affection. Those with destructive tendencies seek to eliminate their object or obstacle. For instance, like if Valerie says to Vicky, "If I can't have you, no one will." Well, the object of affection has become identified as the path to happiness. And when Vicky, trounces away, well, the amount of heartbreak is equal to the amount of destruction.
It would seem that the amount of destructiveness to be found in individuals is proportionate to the amount of which expansiveness of life is curtailed.
So Fromm says that life has an inner dynamism. It tends to grow, to be expressed, to be lived. If that energy is thwarted, it is channeled into destruction.
Destructiveness is the outcome of the unlived life. The final escape mechanism from the burden of freedom. Automaton Conformity.
Rather than renouncing individual integrity or destroying others so that the world ceases to be threatening, most normal people become adapted to the cultural patterns of their society. As a matter of fact, they operate too perfectly, exactly as they should, the price of which is also the loss of self. So remember Reed earlier. He was this smiling, working busybody who packaged himself for society in fancy shoes and leather, right? And when he went looking for himself, who he was, he could only rely on how others perceived him. And of course, their view was shallow and based on his occupation. They just saw him as a shoe guy. Now, this is a problem for democracy. People assume they're individuals, but often it's an illusion of incepted desires. This is also known as mimetic desires. Now, beyond desire, we tend to think we are unique, while we actually regurgitate thoughts we picked up from outside. Now, if we're really pressed on it, we're going to claim these are our original ideas. And this is really kind of a curious double bind that Alan Watts speaks of. An example of it is where society tells people to act naturally, which really means to act as a normal person in your place would act. And by acting as a conformist, you reassure society that you're willing to forego your natural, unique self. So here, Fromm distinguishes between genuine and pseudo-thinking, or genuine ideals and false ideas. Pseudo-thinking may be rational, but it's not original or unique to the person. Thus, like a zombie robot, they're actually beholden to social norms for any circumstance on how to behave.
Every repression illuminates part of one's real self and enforces a substitution of a pseudo-feeling for the one who has been repressed.
So like a mind invasion horror flick, this loss of identity is parasitic, as pieces of pseudo-thinking and acting replace more and more of the real self to cover it over, until eventually the image of the pseudo-self is all that's left. Now, to maintain this false image, this pseudo-self, this person must continually seek approval from others. Now, desperately wanting to relieve any doubts about their place in society, their insecurity makes them readily submit to popular opinion without thought.
Just pick a team, wear a jersey, and chant the slogans. Part 5. Freedom and Democracy.
Okay, this is the awkward part, where I ask you to picture what our society looks like right now. And let's pretend I gave you a minute to picture that. On the extremes of the right, we had Brexit and Trump, as a reaction against systems that disenfranchised or alienated people. And these people seemed to vote not for logic or reason really, but for power and disruption. They also voted for a reversion to nationalism, and they chose a bully as their mascot. On the left, we ended up having race riots and the flexing of social power to cancel the powerful, or at least make them quake in their boots and go into hiding. Of course, we now have language policing and repressive tolerance demanding submission in the name of solidarity. Now, both of these extremes are divisive. It's almost like we're avoiding reason in order to consolidate power, in order to speed things up, and we're demanding less individual thought and more tribal conformity. Now, after reading Fromm, it feels like the burden of making decisions daily, exercising freedom and genuine thinking, with all the manipulation, exploitation, lack of trust, and lack of meaning or true agency, it's just too exhausting. I mean, it might actually just feel better to be a cheerleader than to be a player in this game. Which, oddly, the image of the cheerleader is a great combo of both sadomasochism and automaton conformity. Okay, indeed, 80 years ago, Erich Fromm, writing this book, said fascism could rise in America. As a democracy, our strength is the strength of the individual. When the individual is hollowed out, either selfishly sadistic or masochistic or destructive, we're compulsively driven by emotional turmoil. And our democracy will reflect that social character of repressed turmoil into a leader. If we're a nation of groupthink automaton drones, somehow manipulated by big data and catchy slogans, so envision Pleasantville, but maybe with guns and Harleys, or maybe it's Pleasantville with athleisure and Teslas. Either way, that level of groupthink populism stems from the insecurity of our citizens.
The right to express our thoughts, however, means something, only if we're able to have thoughts of our own.
And this is where the podcast has been going for the last several episodes. If a democracy relies on individuals making intelligent decisions to shape its path into the future, we need healthy, whole individuals, not hacked zombie robot cheerleaders. So one last authority that we're going to talk about that has been destroyed, granting us tremendous freedom from responsibility. And this is the truth. Truth has been discredited. Fromm, writing in 1942, he digs deeper into how truth is manipulated into a metaphysical concept, where it becomes relative, kind of like post-truth. Now, intellectually, we take the truth, and we focus on linguistic usage and categorization, denuding it of its actual purpose, abstracting it until it fragments and loses context and meaning. And what we're forgetting here is that truth's use used to be to aid in the needs of individuals and social groups. Truth, after all, is the strongest weapon for the weak who have no power. So in disempowering the truth, in deconstructing it, we dismantle a weapon against power, but also the ability for us to know the truth of ourselves, which, again, undercuts our own strength as a democracy. So in this case, we the citizens on the inside, not the foreign states, become the biggest threat to our democracy. Fromm says our democracy, that it's the only system that allows for life-affirming full development of the individual, rather than these other systems that subordinate life to extraneous ends in order to weaken individuality. The goal is to become a society of integrated whole individuals, capable of spontaneity, of uniting humans with nature. To do this, we need to provide the cultural conditions that allow the individual to remain decentralized rather than subsumed into the apparatus. Now, for the personal individual, what does this look like? To find the self, to be free and autonomous? Yeah, Fromm says it is in the spontaneous act. The action itself gives strength to the self and forms the basis of integrity.
For the self is as strong as it is active.
To be active, to act organically, spontaneously, and not compulsively, is to live. It is to exist in the present moment. Fromm says the result is not important. It is the experience of acting in the present that relates you to the world. There is a Talmudic saying linking the self, society, and action in the present.
If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am for myself only, what am I? If not now, when?
Thank you so much for sticking with me on this podcast journey. It is great to read a book that stitches together sociology and psychology and some profound insights into human character and just how we behave in general. I'm still really pondering this spontaneity idea, and I have some questions about it because it seems slippery and open for abuse, right? But it also kind of seems to suppose that integrated whole people acting spontaneously in the present is for the good. And that seems to also presuppose that people are basically good, which is kind of a compelling assumption to keep in mind. Now, next time, perhaps we're going to tackle Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies. But, maybe that's just too much sociology all at once. Even though Popper makes some observations that come from a much more sort of analytical and scientific basis than Erich Fromm. And also, I should probably say that Karl Popper would probably despise Erich Fromm's historicism as a means to generate an ideological predictive capacity. So either way, thank you again for being a supporter and listening to the podcast. And if you haven't done so already, please give the show a review or a rating or on whatever platform you use. And it would really help the show out a lot if you could share an episode or two, maybe with a friend, perhaps somebody who would appreciate an explanation of why people give away their freedom while chanting for freedom. And of course, lest we not forget, if you want to receive fuzzy wads of wisdom delivered straight to your inbox every day, you can sign up for a daily email at bellybuttonlint.blog. That's right, bellybuttonlint.blog. All right. Many thanks, and until next time, stay safe.